In the autumn of 1816, in a small town in upstate New York, a 23-year-old blacksmith's son named Eliphalet Remington entered a local shooting match with a rifle he had built himself, forging the barrel from scrap iron in his father's forge and carrying it 10 miles to a gunsmith in Utica to have it rifled and finished properly, since the family forge had no equipment capable of doing that final, precise work itself. He came in second place. It did not matter. The other men at the match had watched what his homemade barrel could do at range, accurate enough that competitors who had just beaten him were the ones asking where they could get one of their own. And by the time he walked home that evening, he was carrying orders for more rifles than he had any concrete plan for building. He had not set out to found a company. He had set out to win a shooting match, lost, and discovered he had built something better than the man who beat him. This is the story of the oldest gunmaker in the United States, a company that outlasted the war that made it famous, survived its own founder's death, reinvented itself as a typewriter manufacturer and back again, and was ultimately destroyed twice by two separate bankruptcies under an ownership structure that had nothing to do with guns at all and everything to do with debt owed to people who had never once fired one of its rifles. Every week, we take apart the story stamped on the barrel flat of an American manufacturer, the founders, the family, and the decisions that built an empire or lost one. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. Eliphalet Remington II was born in 1793 in Suffield, Connecticut, and moved as a young man to his father's forge at a place called Ilion Gulch in Herkimer County, New York, a rural blacksmithing operation with no particular ambition beyond keeping the surrounding family farms equipped with tools and hardware. The rifle barrel he built for that shooting match in 1816 changed the shape of the business permanently. Word of a well-made barrel traveled fast in a farming county where a reliable rifle mattered for more than sport, for hunting, and for the ordinary self-reliance of frontier life. And within a few years, father and son were producing rifle barrels faster than they were producing farm tools, the family trade quietly reversing itself without either man fully planning for it to happen that way. In 1828, the family relocated its growing operation to a 100-acre site on the banks of the Erie Canal, at the place that would become the town of Ilion, New York, chosen specifically because the canal let them ship finished barrels efficiently to markets a rural forge could never have reached on its own. Eliphalet and his son Philo pioneered the first successful cast, steel-drilled rifle barrel manufactured in the United States at that site, a technical achievement that put Remington barrels ahead of most of their domestic competition for a generation, and established a reputation for metallurgical quality the company would trade on for the rest of the century. The company that would eventually be known as E. Remington and Sons had, by the 1840s, grown well beyond a father and son operation, securing a government contract in 1845 to manufacture 5,000 Model 1841 rifles for the United States Army, a single-shot percussion rifle bored to .58 caliber that soldiers came to know as the Mississippi rifle, followed soon after by a contract for 1,000 carbines, the company's first real taste of the scale a government contract could provide. That early relationship with federal procurement, modest as it looked next to what would follow during the Civil War, taught the Remington family something about the arms business that would recur again and again across the next 150 years. That a manufacturer's survival often depended less on the quality of a single design than on maintaining a relationship with whichever government or institution happened to be buying at scale in a given decade. Eliphalet Remington II died in 1861, at the exact moment the country needed his factory more than it ever had. He did not live to see the Civil War that his sons would spend the next 4 years arming, but the transition of the business from father to sons was already complete by the time the war began. His 3 sons, Philo, Samuel, and Eliphalet III, took over as full partners, dividing responsibility along lines that suited each man's strengths. Philo overseeing manufacturing and engineering, Samuel handling contracts, sales, and the company's growing international business. Eliphalet III managing correspondence and internal office affairs with the same careful handwriting. Colleagues remembered him for the rest of his life. Under their direction, the Ilion factory expanded dramatically to meet Union wartime demand, producing rifle muskets, revolvers, and the distinctive Zouave percussion rifle carried by several volunteer regiments through some of the war's bloodiest engagements, output that scaled up from a modest peacetime workshop to one of the largest arms producers in the entire Union war effort within a matter of months, rather than years. The brothers also brought a new mechanism into production, a rolling block breech action patented by a Remington employee named Leonard Geiger in January of 1863 and substantially refined by another company man, Joseph Ryder, into the design that would become the company's signature 19th century product. A single-shot rifle strong enough and simple enough that Remington would go on to sell it in one caliber or another to more than a dozen foreign governments over the following decades. Samuel Remington in particular proved to be a formidable international salesman, traveling extensively and securing major contracts from foreign militaries in the years after the Civil War, at a scale that kept the Ilion factory running at capacity long after American domestic demand alone would have supported a workforce of that size. Samuel died in December of 1882, and his surviving brothers carried the company forward into a decade that would test whether their father's original instincts could survive without either of the men who had inherited them most directly. The rolling block rifle's reach extended far beyond American shores in ways that few 19th century firearms achieved. Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, Spain, France, and a dozen smaller nations all adopted the design in one caliber or another, drawn by the same qualities that had made it attractive to Samuel Remington's international clients in the first place. A mechanism simple enough for a poorly resourced army to maintain in the field and strong enough to handle whatever cartridge a given government's ordnance department preferred. Production licenses and direct export orders kept the Ilion factory running through periods when domestic American demand alone would have forced layoffs, and for several decades the rolling block was, by unit count, one of the most widely distributed single-shot military rifles on the planet. A fact that modern collectors of 19th century military arms still find themselves rediscovering every time a rolling block surfaces in a caliber nobody expected to find one chambered for. The company's survival through that period was never guaranteed, and it is worth remembering that nothing about Remington's endurance across 2 centuries was inevitable at any single point along the way. A different set of sons might have sold the business rather than expanded it after their father's death. A different buyer than Marcellus Hartley might have stripped the company for parts in the 1880s, rather than rebuilding it around a genuine ammunition business. A different set of post-war management decisions might have let the Model 700 languish as a minor product line rather than the volume seller it became. Every one of those decisions could have gone differently, and at several points in the company's first 150 years, it very nearly did. Prosperity did not last. By the 1880s, a combination of overexpansion, foreign contracts that failed to materialize as expected, and a broader economic downturn had pushed the company into serious financial decline, a crisis that the founder's sons, however capable as engineers and salesmen, could not fully resolve on their own. In 1888, the business was acquired by Marcellus Hartley, a New York financier and arms dealer who had already co-founded the Union Metallic Cartridge Company decades earlier and understood the ammunition side of the business as thoroughly as anyone in the country. A reputation built across years of dealing directly with the same government contracts that had once kept Remington's own factory running through the Civil War. Hartley renamed the firm the Remington Arms Company, merged its fortunes tightly with Union Metallic Cartridge's own ammunition production, and restored the company to solvency in time to carry it into the 20th century as a stronger and more diversified business than the founding family had left behind. It is worth pausing on Hartley specifically, because his name resurfaces in gun-making history in a stranger way than most company founders manage, in a story this channel has already told once from the other side. In January of 1902, Hartley had an appointment scheduled with a young firearms designer from Utah who wanted to show him a self-loading shotgun that Winchester had just turned down after a royalty dispute. Hartley died of a heart attack that same afternoon, before the meeting could take place, and the designer, John Moses Browning, was left waiting in the lobby of a company that no longer had anyone in charge of it, before carrying his shotgun across the Atlantic to a Belgian firm called Fabrique Nationale instead. Remington's near miss with Browning's Auto 5 would go on to define a rival company's entire 20th century, the Auto 5 becoming one of the best-selling semi-automatic shotguns ever built, under a roof that was not Remington's, because the one man in the building who could have said yes to it had died a few hours too soon. It is a single afternoon's bad luck that, decades later, still shapes which company's name collectors reach for first when the subject is Browning's early shotguns. The 20th century brought Remington in directions that had very little to do with rifles at all. In 1873, years before the Hartley acquisition, the company had already begun manufacturing typewriters at the same Ilion factory that built its rifles, producing the first commercially successful typewriter under the Remington name, and eventually spinning that business off entirely into what became Remington Rand, a separate corporate lineage that would go on to build early American computers under the same family name long after the two Remingtons had nothing to do with each other beyond a shared word on a nameplate. On the firearms side, the newly stabilized Remington Arms Company spent the early 20th century building a reputation for hunting and sporting arms that would define the brand for ordinary American consumers far more than its 19th century military contracts ever had. A long line of sporting shotguns and bolt-action hunting rifles followed across the first half of the century, culminating in 1962 with the introduction of the Model 700, a bolt-action hunting rifle built on a new receiver design that would go on to become one of the best-selling sporting rifles in American history, carried by hunters across the country for the rest of the century and marketed, accurately for once, as the rifle America actually owned rather than merely admired from behind a gun shop counter, a distinction few competing designs of that same era could genuinely claim for themselves. None of that 19th and 20th century resilience prepared Remington for what happened after 2007. And the mechanism of its final decline will sound familiar to anyone who already knows what happened to Marlin Firearms, because it is, quite literally, the same mechanism applied by the same owner in the same years to a sister company under the identical corporate roof. In 2007, Cerberus Capital Management, a New York private equity firm with tens of billions of dollars in assets under management, acquired Remington Arms as the anchor asset of a new consolidated platform it branded the Freedom Group, and went on to acquire Marlin Firearms as a further addition to that same platform later that same year. The strategic logic Cerberus presented to its investors was the logic of consolidation, shared manufacturing, shared purchasing, rationalized overhead across a portfolio of once independent legacy American gunmakers, each operating with its own aging factory, its own workforce, and its own overhead the new owners considered redundant. The practical result, at Remington exactly as it had been at Marlin, was a debt-financed acquisition that prioritized extracting value from the brand over reinvesting in the factory that actually built it, skilled machinists and engineers leaving faster than they could be meaningfully replaced, and a corporate structure answerable to a private equity fund's own timeline rather than to the expectations of a hunter who had grown up on his father's Model 700. The reckoning arrived from more than one direction at once, and it is worth being precise about which pressures actually caused what, because the popular version of this story tends to compress two separate problems into one. Remington's underlying financial structure, the debt load Cerberus had placed on the company to fund its acquisition strategy, was already unsustainable on its own terms well before any single event forced the issue, a slow structural weakness accumulating for years beneath a brand that, to ordinary hunters buying a shotgun at a sporting goods store, looked entirely unchanged. Layered on top of that structural weakness was a genuine legal and reputational crisis. In December of 2012, a gunman used a Bushmaster-branded rifle, a brand Remington's Freedom Group portfolio owned alongside Remington itself, in a mass shooting at an elementary school in Newtown, Connecticut, that killed 20 children and 6 adults. Families of the victims subsequently sued Remington, arguing the company bore responsibility for how that specific rifle had been marketed to civilian buyers in the years leading up to the shooting. The lawsuit worked its way through Connecticut courts for years, surviving a significant legal challenge under the federal law that normally shields American gunmakers from this kind of liability entirely, and Remington's own bankruptcy filings repeatedly complicated the litigation's path forward, delaying resolution by years at a time. Historians and industry analysts who have studied the company's finances since have generally concluded that Remington's core financial collapse predated and was largely separate from the lawsuit, rooted instead in the 2007 leveraged acquisition itself. But the legal and reputational weight of the Sandy Hook case became inseparable from the company's final years, regardless of which crisis actually came first chronologically. Retailers dropped the brand from their shelves under public pressure. In the years following the shooting, insurers grew increasingly reluctant to underwrite the company's liability coverage at any reasonable premium, and a firearms industry, already wary of appearing to defend a specific product tied to a specific tragedy, gave Remington less public cover than a company in genuine financial distress might otherwise have expected from its own trade association. Remington filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in March of 2018, carrying more than $950 million in debt, and emerged within 2 months under a restructuring plan backed by roughly 97% of its creditors, an unusually fast exit driven by a pre-negotiated agreement rather than a genuine operational turnaround, which changed the ownership structure but addressed almost none of the underlying damage to the company's manufacturing capacity or its skilled workforce. It was not enough. In July of 2020, Remington Outdoor Company filed for Chapter 11 a second time, and this filing proved terminal for the company as a unified entity. The Sandy Hook families, still pursuing their lawsuit through the bankruptcy proceedings, argued publicly that Remington was using the accelerated sale process specifically to escape their claims before any settlement could be reached, pointing to the company's own strong sales performance during the first half of that year as evidence the bankruptcy timing served the litigation more than any genuine financial emergency. In July of 2021, insurers for the by-then-defunct company agreed to pay out the full available coverage. A settlement finalized in February of 2022 at $73 million for the families of 9 victims, one of the first successful judgments of its kind against an American firearms manufacturer, and a case that legal analysts have since described as a template for future litigation against the broader industry. The assets themselves were split among 7 separate buyers in the 2020 bankruptcy sale, a fragmentation that would have been unthinkable to any of the 3 brothers who once ran the company as a single, undivided family concern. Vista Outdoor acquired the largest portion of the business, the ammunition operations that trace their lineage directly back to Marcellus Hartley's original Union metallic cartridge merger more than 130 years earlier. A separate buyer acquired the firearms manufacturing side and relaunched it under the name Arms, continuing to build rifles and shotguns under the Remington name at the same Ilion, New York site the company had occupied since 1828, employing a workforce that, while smaller than in the company's mid-century peak, still includes machinists working in the same buildings their predecessors once did, still cutting steel a short walk from the stretch of the Erie Canal that first brought the family's barrels to market 2 centuries ago. The ammunition brand itself, Remington Ammunition, eventually came under the ownership of the Czechoslovak Group, the same Prague-based conglomerate that, in the very same period, was separately acquiring Colt's manufacturing company on the other side of the American firearms industry. A coincidence of ownership that has left 2 of America's oldest and most storied gunmakers answering, in one form or another, to the same corporate address in the Czech Republic. A detail neither company's 19th century founders could have imagined in their most pessimistic assessment of where American industry might one day be headed. This is not a story about a company that failed because its rifles stopped working. Every core Remington design that mattered, the rolling block, the Model 700, The ordinary hunting shotgun that generations of American fathers handed down to their sons on cold opening mornings of deer season remained mechanically sound and commercially popular right up until the moment the ownership structure above the factory collapsed under debt that had nothing whatsoever to do with the quality of what the factory built. It is a story about how a company can survive a founder's death, a civil war, an economic depression, and a complete pivot into typewriters and back, only to be undone by a financial structure imposed on it 2 centuries after it was founded, by owners who had never fired one of its rifles, and were never going to be the ones standing behind a counter, explaining to a customer why the trigger pull felt different than it used to, or why the wait for parts had grown so much longer than it once was. 200 years after Eliphalet Remington carried a homemade barrel 10 miles to a gunsmith in Utica, rifles and shotguns are still being built at the Ilion, New York factory on the banks of the Erie Canal, the same site the family chose in 1828 specifically because the water route let them reach a market their forge never could have reached on its own. The company that owns the name today is not the company Eliphalet founded, is not the company his sons expanded through a civil war fought for the survival of the nation itself, and is not even the company that Marcellus Hartley rescued from insolvency in 1888. It has passed through the hands of a Wall Street financier, a typewriter conglomerate, a private equity fund, a bankruptcy court, and a Prague-based holding company, none of whom share a surname with the blacksmith who started it all in a forge that no longer exists. The factory itself does not seem to have noticed any of that history. It is still standing on the same canal bank, still stamping out the same basic promise a blacksmith's son made to a handful of fellow competitors in a shooting match in 1816, that a rifle built carefully enough would outlast the man who built it, the family that inherited it, and every subsequent owner who came looking for something the factory itself was never actually built to provide them. If you want more stories about the American manufacturers whose names survived long after the companies that built them did not, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.